Investigative journalist Sharyl Attkisson tells us how the news media taught us to love censorship and hate journalism. And December 7th, 1941, Japan launches a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. In less than 2 hours, 2,400 Americans are dead, and the nation is never the same. Good evening and welcome to The Nation Speaks. We're back with the same great show and a new great name. I'm your host, Cindy Drucare. Earlier, I sat down with 5-time Emmy Award-winning investigative journalist Sharyl Attkisson. Over the last few years, Sharyl has turned her critical eye on her own industry, revealing some disturbing trends in what you watch and read in the nation's most established media. We talk about the coverage of the 2020 election and her new book. You wrote a book called Slanted, and actually in your jacket cover, you basically summarize very well what this is about. When the facts don't fit their narrative, the media abandons the facts, not the narrative. That's a big statement, and we'll go into it, and I'd like to go into it in the context of the recent election, because I feel like everything you write in the book is just exemplified perfectly with what's going on now.
Slanted is sort of, I see it, the third in a trilogy of books that chronicles the devolution of the news as we once knew it, to the place we are today, where journalists, as we see, no longer often see their job as reflecting the facts that are on the ground and hearing from different viewpoints and reporting just sort of what's happening in a factual sense. Now, many, if not most, journalists see their job as advocating for one side or one issue, censoring and making sure other sides are either controversialized because they go up against the powerful interests that are pulling the strings in all of this, or that they're not heard at all. And so we see coming into this election in 2020, I think the media showed a lot of its true colors in that respect. After promising in 2016, after that debacle, that we would self-correct and self-reflect, instead, we seem to double down and go full headstrong into the 2020 election in a one-sided sense, closing our eyes in the immediate aftermath of the election to anything that looked odd or irregular, instead of from a neutral and objective standpoint, seeing how strange this election was and viewing it with the proper rational skepticism that it requires. Instead, we started advocating and saying, taking aside, the election is over, Trump is not being patriotic by questioning it, there's nothing to see here, after one of the oddest elections, at least in my time in this country.
Right, exactly. And we were talking just before we went on the air, too, about how if this election had played out in the opposite way, you talk about the substitution game. Imagine, if this was 2016 and what happened this time, happened with Hillary Clinton, how the press would have reacted.
So let me just play that out for a moment. If you imagine if in 2016, Hillary Clinton had appeared to be winning a landslide on election night, and then if in those days afterwards, as Democrats were blocked from observing votes and tons of big drops of ballots from somewhere and mail-in ballots and, record numbers of absentee ballots were counted and counting was sporadically stopped, and there were a lot of allegations of irregularities. If during that period of time, this script was flipped and suddenly Donald Trump pulled ahead and had some great landslide instead of Hillary Clinton, I know for a fact the press would not have just let that go. Doesn't mean there's fraud, but certainly there are rational questions to ask when you see this odd, unusual pattern coupled with many allegations of irregularities from firsthand observers and allegations of fraud. And instead, we get this collective yawn from much of the media that say, move along, there's nothing to see.
It's one of the things that's amazed me. We've been covering, there's allegations of fraud. There's a lot of news around this. And most of the headlines you see are baseless claims of fraud. And that was even in, day one, day two after the election, calling them baseless when there wasn't any chance to have seen the evidence yet.
Well, let's take the 30,000 foot level view and understand, as I've tried to chronicle in my books, that the entire news industry has largely been co-opted and taken over quite successfully the first 2 decades of this century by political and corporate interests that operate using, I say, the smear industry, a multi-billion-dollar industry of nonprofits, global law firms, crisis management firms, PR firms, LLCs. And they collectively have figured out how to manipulate the news, how to get their people hired in newsrooms, how to get their people placed as analysts where they can direct the narratives and put propaganda on the news. And so in 2016, I postulate that even though they had collectively controlled the information landscape on the news quite successfully, Donald Trump still got elected, and that kind of panicked them when they saw this coming. And they realized that people are still able to get unfettered access to information online. So what did they do? I mark a very distinct time in September of 2016 in which these powerful interests decided we have to control the internet. How do you control social media and the unfettered access people have to information we don't want them to see? Well, you have to convince them that they want you to interfere with their information. You have to create the appearance that there's a demand for this curation of their information in the news. And that's what they've been doing the past 4 years, convincing us that we shouldn't hear all of that fake news and the dangerous studies that they don't want us to see and the opinions that they determine are off bounds. That's a form of control. But when I say in the subtitle of my book that they've taught people to love censorship and hate journalism, I mean, we've now been conditioned to invite this sort of interference between us and our information. A lot of people say, I want my information fact checked. That's a good thing. This bad stuff shouldn't be passed around. And what they really mean is, I can process all of this information and make sense of what I should and what I shouldn't, but I don't want other people to see it. They shouldn't have access to the information. They might draw the wrong conclusion.
What that makes me think of when I'm hearing you describe that, I feel like, and I had this conversation actually with Alan Dershowitz the other day, that I feel like people are getting conditioned to walk into totalitarianism because, the censorship starts with things they agree with, but there's no stopping it, once we allow it in. Do you think people are realizing the path that we're on and they'll put the brakes on at some point?
Well, I think some people do and some people don't. And the thing that started to frighten me as I've analyzed this in the past 10 years is this slow creep goes unnoticed by people who are integrating into the system and into society, and the younger generation who will know no differently. The first time I realized that is when we first learned our government was spying on me as a journalist. We learned this when CBS announced it when I worked there in 2013. And when this was first coming out, what Edward Snowden revealed, the NSA whistleblower about spying on American citizens, all of that stuff was so shocking when we first learned of it. But then over time, we became numb, one case after another. Nothing was really done about it. Today's younger generation just accepts to some degree that the government spies on us. No sense of outrage anymore. And I think there's that same mission creep with information where younger people or people that haven't read George Orwell's 1984 and Animal Farm, they may not fully appreciate what this country was founded on and why it's important to protect all kinds of access to all kinds of information, not just the stuff you think is true or that you think is positive, all information except very narrow cases, that which is considered illegal here, are supposed to be protected and accessible. To take an extreme case, imagine going to the supermarket and buying what we call a National Enquirer tabloid magazine that has stories about space aliens on the front, and having the grocery store manager stop you on the checkout line and say, you can't buy that. I think you might believe something that's in it, or I think that might be harmful to you. It's none of his business. You have a right to see that. But that's in essence what people are doing today when they determine information, whether on the news or online, is stuff that you shouldn't see or be able to learn about.
I'm thinking also that young people have no idea that there was something called privacy, because our lives are complete open books, on our phones and on our computers, and there's no actual memory, no even collective memory if you're under a certain age, when that didn't exist.
I have heard people say after it was exposed that the government was spying on people, including me and other journalists, I would hear a comment, well, I don't have anything to hide. They can look at my stuff, without understanding the slippery slope. We're talking about if you're just assuming the best of intentions by all government figures now and forevermore, and that you're happy to open up your life to them, any aspect of it, unwanted and uninvited, I guess that's your right. But I think about that they don't understand information such as in my case, somebody had planted classified documents on my computer. There are nefarious people out there that could be looking for something to use against you, something very personal that's not illegal, just something you'd prefer not to be aired in public. They could create false things about you. I mean, there's all kinds of things. In fact, one of the whistleblowers in the case of the spying against me, who was part of one of the government spy operations against me, told me that they schemed to download pornography, child pornography on my husband's computer, knowing that we had a young daughter at home. And then they were going to alert the police. This was all to get me in trouble and to get me off of covering the stories that I was covering. That plan was never in the end fully executed. But the fact that they would even consider it, can you imagine if child porn is found on your computer? Do you ever really get over that? You can say all you like that you didn't put it there and you don't know how it got there. But imagine if government actors, bad people, are thinking about doing things like this, what could be going on?
Wow, that's a really astounding story. And yeah, once the accusation is out there, I mean, the media is not a court of law, and once the accusations are in headlines, there's no erasing that. It's and that's also sort of an interesting double standard too, because in the one sense, you know, if there's a headline about you, there's no erasing it, and in the other sense, I feel like there's this very short-term memory of bad actions that actually happen or that they want us to erase.
Absolutely. I mean, other things are put down what I call the memory hole, borrowing a phrase from George Orwell's 1984. I ask people if you've ever read it or if you've never read it. It's chilling how much this book, written, I think, in the 1940s or 50s about a futuristic society, a dystopian society.
48, actually. That's why it became 84.
Okay. Well, they're talking about 84, but they really could have been talking about today, even though Orwell did not envision precisely the internet. He envisioned a society where those in power were rewriting history in real time to line up with the prevailing party's opinion of what it should look like. So rewriting history was a constant act that was always changing. And this was the protagonist in the novel. It was his job to constantly rewrite history. And then the old versions of what had really happened at some point were put down the memory hole. And any old documents that could prove that things used to be different or that things were being rewritten, these had to be put down the memory hole. And I think of that when I think about aspects of our history people are trying to erase, when I think about pieces on the internet of distasteful things that powerful interests don't want us to see, or even a peer-reviewed published study that it's off the narrative to some corporate interest. They don't want you to see this particular study. It's put down the memory hole. Google won't let you see it. Or if you happen to run across it, it'll be fact-checked and controversialized as untrue. And I think we're very much in this world that George Orwell envisioned in that novel, 1984.
Yeah, and there aren't even things like corrections and retractions. The entire, you know, Russia collusion, what we now know is a hoax. There was, you know, nothing there. Have there been any retractions, corrections, anything from the media that was followed it for so many years?
Shockingly, not even a single that I know of, mea culpa. What should have happened after that? I mean, we should have been so embarrassed, and there should have been a professional review convened, either by independently by news organizations like the New York Times that got it so wrong, and Washington Post, everybody, or even a collective that looked at and said, how did we go down this trail in such a one-sided fashion where, for example, every time the Trump people said we aren't spies for Russia, which turned out to be true, they were immediately, quite literally branded liars, telling lies by people who didn't know otherwise. There was no evidence otherwise, but they never said that. And then those making the accusations anonymously, even after getting caught leaking false information over and over again, whatever they said was immediately accepted as the proven truth. And I will say the reason I think that is, why is it that there's no self-correction? Why don't we seem embarrassed? Why aren't people fired for what they've done? If you understand the transformation of news into this propaganda and narrative machine by people now working in news organizations and pulling the strings, this is still mission accomplished. They wanted a particular narrative out. Their goal is no longer to reflect the facts on the ground or journal the truth. What they're trying to do is sway public opinion. So if they turn out to be wrong in the end, that's okay with them because they had a certain narrative advance over the prior 3 years and they lived to see another day.
So there are journalists like yourself, good investigative journalists, and a lot of them now have gone independent. There's media like ours, NTD and the Epoch Times, that we'll follow the facts and report what we found. In fact, we still haven't called the 2020 election because we're waiting for, all the legal processes to play out. So do you see hope in people like yourselves? And there's a lot of independent journalists now.
I think so. You see what happens, though. So as soon as Epoch Times or Epoch Times became a factor in reporting some great investigative stories without spin, they were roundly attacked. I'll bet their Wikipedia page says all kinds of fake things about them. And the New York Times will come after them. And the mainstream media that are part of this narrative machine, you get attacked. And then you go on social media and they know how to throttle down your exposure and pull down your links. There's all of these repercussions for actually being a fair reporter or an off-narrative news organization. But I find hope in the fact that there are a lot of people looking for solutions, technical solutions that will allow unfettered access to information in a way that you can't be deplatformed. So if you tell the truth or you report the facts or you do stories that are off-narrative, like people used to do, there will be a way to protect it where you're not beholden to these big tech companies. People are looking for those solutions. Is there a market for it? Absolutely. If you just look at wherever you stand on politics in this country, maybe you did or didn't support Donald Trump, I think there's hope in the notion anyway that tens of millions of people who were told not to vote for him, that he was evil incarnate and racist and sexist and all of those things, they voted for him nonetheless, meaning they're ignoring the narratives. They're seeing beyond this managed information landscape that's online. And I think there's a lot of hope in that.
And not only that, they're willing to stick their heads out because they're going in the streets in big numbers right now, calling for some accountability around the allegations of election fraud. NTD, we've been streaming a lot of the coverage of that, and we have massive numbers of people watching and, messaging us. I'm not seeing this anywhere else. I would have no idea that this is happening.
If you try to find these hearings where they're actually putting forth evidence of firsthand witness accounts and sworn testimony, it's very hard to find this. But this is what all the media should be doing, at least fairly having an airing of these allegations and credible claims being presented under oath in many different states.
And actually, this is something I've noticed too that I'd like to hear your last thoughts on, because we should wrap up. But when the claims are dismissed, they're just dismissed summarily, but you don't actually hear the counterclaims or the arguments against what are being presented. It's just they're baseless claims dismissed in headlines. That's
sort of a tell, the notion that one side can say almost anything and it's accepted as if it's a fact, but the other side can provide all kinds of claims that appear credible and evidence under sworn oath or with testimony. And they're told right off the top that there's nothing to them, we're not to hear them. And they, as you say, won't even summarize the claims. I will bet that most of the reporters reporting on it never watched these hearings because they already know how the story has to turn out. What's the point of watching them? And I think that, one good example is when Sidney Powell, one of the attorneys helping the Trump side, filed a lawsuit. And I was trying to look for the link, first of all, and hunting around. The main predominant narrative that was out, the story that was circulating was Sidney Powell files typo-riddled lawsuit with formatting errors. And then another reporter would say that someone had discovered this, and nobody was talking about what was in it except that it was without evidence or without substance and that they were supposedly baseless claims, whatever they were. But everybody was on the narrative that there were typos in the complaint. And of course, we're supposed to think that because there are typos in the complaint, that there must not be any merit to anything that's in there. And this is just, I think, a perfect example of narratives being circulated to try to shape public opinion. Well, thank you so much, Sharyl. Fascinating conversation, and I hope you'll come back again sometime. Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Coming up after the break, December 7th, 1941, 2,400 Americans died at the U.S. Naval Station in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. That unexpected attack changed everything. But first, here's America Q&A.
Yes, I'm an American. I was born here, and I believe in the system, and I believe democracy works, so yes.
I do. Well, I believe in living in a country with freedom and choices We don't all have to agree, but I think we should all be very respectful to each other.
Very patriotic.
We got a family of service folks, so absolutely, they serve the country and support that.
Make sure the country stays honest and fair and for everybody.
I consider myself extremely patriotic.
I do consider myself patriotic, and just the way I was raised by my father and my grandfather fought in World War II. My dad was in Vietnam, so all military.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah, I think so. So that our next generations can have a good home.
I love my country. I'm committed to my country.
Yeah, of course. I think I'm patriotic.
I consider myself patriotic because I believe that this country has given myself and my family many opportunities, and we've been able to have a better life.
I think growing up, we were taught in school to be patriotic just because we say the Pledge of Allegiance.
Absolutely. I consider myself very patriotic.
I see gratitude because we have a lot of privileges that other countries don't have. In that way, I feel patriotic.
Welcome back. In 1941, war was raging across the world in Europe, Asia, Africa, but Americans had no appetite for joining the conflict. That soon changed when Japan brought war to America. Historian and author Craig Shirley explains the far-reaching impact of Japan's fateful attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Craig, welcome.
Thank you, Cindy. Good to be with you.
So I'd like to start with, I think for especially a lot of younger Americans, because the attack on Pearl Harbor is so etched in the psyche, they don't realize the serious impact, how much that changed everything. So can you take us back to December 6th, 1941, and give us a sense of the mood in America at that time?
Yeah. December 6th, 1941, America was an isolationist country. There was war in Europe. We wanted no part of it. Hitler had already invaded Poland, and then the Low Countries, Holland, Netherlands, and other countries, and of course later invaded France. We wanted no part of it whatsoever, and we were content. Now, we were in the throes of the Great Depression, but we were starting to come out of it. There was a modicum of light at the end of the tunnel with the economy, and people were fairly, content. They were making a wage. There were goods to be bought. The food was plentiful, and we were at peace, and that was the most important thing. America was a very contented country, happy to stay out of the rest of the world conflict.
And there was a movement at the time, an America First movement, that's directly related to that. Can you explain what that was about?
Yeah, right after we'd had a bad taste in our mouth ever since the end of World War I. There was a saying going around the United States that when all we got out of was debt, death, and George M. Cohan. But for the succeeding years, up until 1939, we passed restrictive trade policies. We passed restrictive immigration policies, including Japan, and we wanted no part of the rest of the world. That was the attitude of the vast majority of Americans, and it was bipartisan. Republicans and Democrats were members of America First movement. The America First movement sprang up formally after Hitler invaded Poland in September of 1939, and it became a nationwide organization. Charles Lindbergh was the head of it, but so were many other individuals. Walt Disney and anybody you can imagine. Tom Connolly, who was the Democratic senator from Texas, was a member of the America First, and they were planning in the 1942 elections to field candidates in every congressional district in America if neither candidate pledged to stay out of the European war. That's how powerful they were. They commanded great respect. They were a great third-party movement that was spreading all across the United States as of September of 39, 40, and into 41.
So it was basically a peace movement, was their main tenet.
Exactly. That's exactly what it was. It was a peace movement. And it was a bipartisan peace movement, and people from all walks of life, including military commanders of World War I, who were signed on as spokesmen and leaders for the America First movement.
So December 7th, 1941, early in the morning in Hawaii, there's an attack from Japan that was completely unexpected. It was a surprise attack. What was the reaction across the nation immediately after that?
Shock, awe, anger, revenge. Is that there was a lot of what made it so what made Americans so angry, Cindy, was that Japan attacked and then declared war, and that just offended our sense of fair play and our sense of right and wrong, and that really just stuck in the craw of a lot of Americans. And there were people who were all over the country were saying, "Where's Pearl Harbor?" And the answer was, it's a place the Japanese are going to be more sorry about than the Americans ever were. 2,403 Americans were killed at Pearl Harbor. Another 1,200 maimed or badly wounded. Our naval fleet was essentially destroyed. The Arizona was blown to smithereens, as were several other ships, including the Oklahoma. Most of them, interestingly, most of the ships were refloated, except the Arizona and I believe the Utah were refloated and went later into battle against the Japanese. But there was the great courage of the American people was the sacrifice they made when they heard about the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and everything was rationed. Everything was gasoline was rationed, meat was rationed, butter was rationed, vegetables were rationed. Everything went into what was called the war effort. Shoes were rationed, clothing was rationed. Everything there you go. Pictures of rationed coupons right there on the screen, and the sacrifices the Americans made. My father was a Boy Scout at the time. The Boy Scouts were used by the national government to distribute posters to churches and bars and restaurants. Loose lips sink ships, and scrap metal drives and scrap iron drives and all things urging Americans to do their patriotic effort. My mother had a victory garden, and victory gardens were very, very important because all the vegetables were going to feed the American military from big farms. Is that vegetable gardens were taking place, and they produced 1/3 of all the vegetables consumed in America during the time of World War II.
So, Craig,
we
just have about 1 minute left. No problem. I just want to get to what changed then. I mean, obviously America went to war, but this isolationist stance that was there, everything changed, right?
Never again. We were never again in isolation. Everything changed. It is the linchpin of history for us, Cindy. We never become another isolationist country. We go into the space because of World War II. We become the dominant power. World power because of the atom bomb, but also because of rockets we develop, and also because of airplanes that we develop. Civil rights changes in America, women's rights changes in America. The unions become more powerful. The culture changes. Everything that you can imagine at a cultural level, political level, and an economic level changes in America because of December 7th, 1941.
So we have to wrap up here. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
You bet. Thank you.
And that's all for tonight's show. Thank you so much for watching The Nation Speaks. Join us again tomorrow night at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And from all of us here, good night.